Following the discussion on the pancreatic islets, the next section on the endocrine system chapter is going to look at growth hormone. By looking at the story of growth hormone, we can see a slightly more involved set of interactions between the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and endocrine tissue elsewhere in the body. Also, it addresses an understanding of what was covered in A&P1 about how bones grow longer at the epiphyseal plate. This figure is a nice demonstration of the idea of how growth hormone coming from the pituitary influences growth in tissues in the body, both directly and indirectly through an intermediate molecule called IGF-1 that's produced by the liver. Now, IGF-1 stands for insulin-like growth factor 1. It's a molecule that's related to insulin at some point far in the past in some organism. The DNA for the insulin gene was duplicated, and one copy of that remained as insulin, as it was required to fulfill the needs that insulin fills, but the other one was less constrained and was able to mutate and become a different molecule. And that other molecule became part of this growth hormone story as it became useful in helping growth hormone cause growth of the body. This figure gives an overview of the growth hormone IGF axis, how all of this influences growth of tissues. To begin with, growth hormone is released from the anterior pituitary at the activation of regulatory hormone from the hypothalamus. So cells in the hypothalamus release growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH, which stimulates the specific cells in the anterior pituitary which produce it to release growth hormone into the circulation. Growth hormone has three major types of targets, and therefore about three major functions. I want to start with C first, what's called the diabetogenic effect, which is growth hormone's effects on the liver. Now, what's most important in the sense of that it causes growth is that it releases IGF-1, which is one of the two IGF molecules that exist, but the only one that's part of the growth hormone effect. Growth hormone also stimulates the liver to break down glycogen to provide glucose available for the growth effects that are going to take place. Those growth effects, which are listed in Part B here, are really growth of most every tissue. The targets that they list here are bone cells, muscle cells, the nervous system, and immune system cells. But really, if you think about IGF-1 basically causing the growth of bones during childhood and adolescence, part of its major function is actually to the cartilage at the epiphyseal plate or growth plate. Those cells will divide, proliferate, grow larger, and the tissue will calcify to become new bone because of the effects of IGF on them. Now, you'll see in this box B about growth effects, it does talk about growth hormone having specific effects on the growth of certain tissues. And there's a dual or synergistic effect between growth hormone and IGF-1, apparently. It seems that either can cause growth. IGF tends to have the more classical causing height kind of growth effects, but when the two are combined, the most robust growth effects are seen. And then in the first panel, A, it mentions glucose-sparing effects of growth hormone. Now, in C, the diabetogenic effect is increasing blood glucose levels by breaking down glycogen. In A, it's sparing glucose by providing other fuel sources to tell adipose tissue to break down fats and make those fats available for mitochondrial reactions that are going to produce ATP, which will help with the growth processes that are going to take place. The yellow line in this figure, coming off of the picture of the liver, that suggests the effect that IGF-1 has on growth, also shows a branch off that line going back to the hypothalamus. That's a negative feedback cycle which will tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing GHRH, and in fact, on top of that, start releasing another hormone called growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which will have an effect directly on the anterior pituitary. IGF will also cause a negative feedback signal directly on the anterior pituitary to stop growth hormone release. So there we have the big picture. GHRH from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to release GH, which tells the liver to release IGF. And then IGF acts as a feedback mechanism to shut down the expression of growth hormone. Now, the growth hormone inhibiting hormone factor puts a little extra into the mix, that there's an active inhibition that takes place. Other negative feedback systems can just be the negative feedback signal decreases the stimulation of the anterior pituitary. But here it's a little bit different. And growth hormone is released at night, and actually for humans there are 2 pulses of growth hormone, which suggests, and I don't have sources to back this up, but it suggests that the releasing hormone causes release of GH, which eventually causes an increase in IGF-1 in the blood, which then feeds back to shut things down. But then another pulse will come along as that negative feedback signal slackens off, and there's time for another spike of growth hormone after that. I want to come back to the insulin story for just a second. If you think about what's suggested there in growth hormone. Now, what growth hormone is responsible for in causing growth is really limited to childhood and adolescence, because people should be to their full height and growth plates should completely calcify by about 15 to 20 years of age, but certainly people live much longer than that. And growth hormone spikes at night continue afterwards. And so if we consider what growth hormone does to help growth through providing extra energy, we can see that it also has an effect in later life to complement the blood glucose regulation story that we saw from the pancreas. The diabetogenic effect that was suggested for growth hormone a couple of slides back is the same as glucagon's effects. Now, diabetes is when blood glucose levels are high because insulin's not doing its job. The reason why blood glucose levels is high depends on the situation. It's usually associated with spikes following feeding, but if you think about it, glucagon's job is to raise blood glucose levels, and so it is diabetogenic in a sense. Now, if you consider glucagon and growth hormone's effects, they're going to help each other out. And also consider, when do you need the strongest signal to keep blood glucose levels high? It's at night when you're asleep and you're not eating. And so to supplement glucagon's effects to keep blood sugar levels up, growth hormone, which is being released at night throughout the rest of your life, is also going to be able to provide another stimulus to keep blood glucose levels higher. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. So the main effect that IGF-1 has in response to growth hormone is to stimulate the increase in length in long bones, which means that it stimulates the increase in cartilage proliferation at the epiphyseal plate, which is going to cause the long bone to grow longer.